Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the unwinnable war in Ukraine, which has already cost American taxpayers billions of dollars. Now, anyone who dares question the Uniparty's narrative on the war in Ukraine is obviously going to get criticized. That's okay. The media has been complicit in pushing this narrative. Think about, when was the last time you saw live footage on the ground in Ukraine? It's rare because Ukraine is losing and is losing badly. This comes after we just gave Ukraine $60 billion more of taxpayer money earlier this year to prolong this war. I see President Zelensky, a Uniparty puppet, is here begging for more money on a campaign trail with Kamala Harris. It feels like he's here every other month demanding more and more taxpayer money. That's because he knows that the money spigot will cut off if Kamala Harris doesn't win in November. Look, this subject is too important to go unaddressed. Over the last several months, I've asked multiple high-ranking members of the Biden-Harris administration to articulate what it is trying to accomplish in Ukraine. Just tell us. Tell us what it'll cost and how we plan to achieve these results. Basically, I'm asking, what is our game plan? Not one official in this administration has answered my questions clearly, not one. One of the most interesting responses I received was from Secretary Austin himself, Secretary of Defense. He says, we want to see Ukraine remain a sovereign, independent, and democratic state that has the ability to defend itself and its territory and deter aggression. Okay? Secretary Austin continued, stating that it is the administration's goal to bring Ukraine into NATO while simultaneously blaming Russia for NATO's past expansion. Now, here's when the D.C. establishment really gets upset. I'm going to review a few undeniable facts about NATO's history. Predictably, the Uniparty will accuse me of spewing Russian propaganda, but these are the facts, and that's what we have to go by, and we can't shy away from them. NATO was formed 75 years ago in 1949 as a defensive alliance to counter the communist Soviet Union. It was wildly successful in that it maintained peace through deterrence throughout the Cold War. NATO helped us win the Cold War and dissolve communist Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended in 1991, Ukraine instantly became the world's third largest nuclear power. Ukraine. Following a series of negotiations, Ukrainians agreed to give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from both Russia and NATO, territorial integrity, and political independence. These efforts were successful because they included assurances by many heads of state, including our own, that would no eastward expansion of NATO towards Russia ever happen. It was over. At that time, there were 16 NATO members. Today, 33 years later, after this agreement, there are 32 NATO members, even though in 1991, we agreed to no more eastward expansion. We broke the agreement. We, NATO, and the United States. NATO has expanded eastward 7 times since that agreement in 1991. The largest expansion in 2004 included 2 countries that share a border with Russia, Estonia, Latvia. Today, NATO includes 3 countries that border Russia. 6 NATO members are former Warsaw Pact members. The bulk of this expansion happened before Russia annexed Crimea and invaded part of Ukraine in 2014. Again, these are all the facts. All play a part in the NATO story and Russia's response to it. Here's another fact. NATO's expansion was on NATO's terms, separate and apart from any Russian input or activity. Let me read that again. NATO's expansion was on NATO's terms, separate and apart from any Russian input or activity, contrary to Secretary Austin's claims. Ask yourself, how would the U.S. react if China or Russia entered a mutual defense organization with Mexico or Canada? How would we react? What if they started basing troops or participating in military exercises just miles from our homeland? Having covered a brief history of NATO, let's ask logical follow-up questions that we should always ask before involving ourselves in any armed conflict. First, how far are we willing to take this proxy war with Russia? How far are we? Did we think about that before we got into this? Are we committed to winning as Russia's president is, Vladimir Putin? Are we committed to winning? What happens if the momentum turns? What happens if it turns against Ukraine and Russia starts making real gains, as it appears is happening today? Will the U.S. send more taxpayer money, more weapons? Will NATO send troops? Will the United States send troops? What's the plan? War is a serious business. We should understand that by now. You don't half-ass your way into one, and certainly don't half-ass your way out of one. That doesn't seem to resonate around here. Since the Russian offensive began, we have sent more than $174 billion taxpayer dollars to Ukraine, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Recently, the Biden-Harris administration announced their intent to send an additional $700 million taxpayer dollars to Ukraine in cash. Are you kidding me? Why on earth would we give cash to the most corrupt country on the face of the planet? So after all that, after the last 2.5 years of funding billions of taxpayer dollars, getting hundreds of thousands of people killed, what do we have to show for it? The war has only gotten worse. Hundreds of thousands are dead. Ukraine is becoming more desperate as its forces are engineering widespread insubordination and even mass desertion. We don't hear that on TV. We don't hear that in this propaganda media. Over 6 million Ukrainians have fled the country, have left their country. Ukraine is playing with fire, now seeking to conduct offensive operations deep inside Russia. Why? You can't win. Most recently, Ukraine launched a drone attack that struck in Moscow. What are we trying to do? Start World War III? Most recently, Ukraine launched a drone attack that struck several other office buildings in Moscow. Adding to the uncertainty of this situation, this administration's current policy towards Ukraine has all the hallmarks of every Biden-Harris foreign policy decision that has preceded it: weak planning, disaster results, zero leadership. This administration never considered the consequences of Ukraine losing. How can that ever happen? This is really sad. It's sad for the United States of America. It's sad for the taxpayers. It's sad for our military. It's sad for our allies, and it's sad for NATO. Some of the Democratic colleagues have said Joe Biden never made a correct decision in foreign policy in 40 years. Well, he hadn't broke that. Biden-Harris administration has dumped billions of dollars also into the lap of Iran. Removed the terrorist designation from the Houthis, who, by the way, we're fighting against right now, but they're not terrorists. alienated one of our most important friends, Saudi Arabia, and they've executed a disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal that unnecessarily cost the lives of Americans. All this weakness was a direct signal to our adversaries. Now's the time to make your move. And that's exactly what our adversaries, China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea, are doing. China today testing another ballistic missile into the Pacific Ocean. They're preparing. Russia now has pounced on Ukraine. Whatever you hear in the media is not true. It is a slaughter. Iran has released its proxies and terrorized the Middle East. Our ally Israel is fighting for its life against Hamas following the gruesome October 7th attack almost a year ago. The Houthis are a bunch of people that live in the mountains, have been emboldened to attack ships, which has negatively impacted global trade. We can't even beat the Houthis, and we're trying to create more wars. China has stepped up its aggression in the China Sea. We're losing influence across the globe, especially in South America and Africa, where the Chinese and the Russians are taking over. We're leaving leaps and bounds. So let's be very clear. Despite the administration's incompetence, I still believe Putin was wrong to invade Ukraine. I think we all do. He should have withdrawn his forces immediately after it started. Putin is responsible for his actions, and he has made no secret of the fact that he sees Ukraine as historically a part of Russia. At the same time, I do not think that Ukraine's border is more important than ours, not even close, which we have been completely neglected and neglecting the last 3.5 years. We have been overrun, southern border, northern border, and from airplanes all over the world flying into our cities. It's an embarrassment. We do not need the administration to enable Ukraine to use offensive weapons and strike deep into Russia. That cannot happen. We are on the cusp of a nuclear war. Nobody seems concerned. It won't happen. Yes, it will happen. Putin has told us it will happen if you continue this. This would only escalate this conflict to an entirely new level that none of us can ever imagine. Do you think this offensive would convince Putin to come to the table and negotiate a peace agreement? Well, I would hope we would go, but we do not seem to want to make a peace agreement. We had better, and we better do it in the very near future. This will provoke him to even more deadly weapons if we continue to attack within their borders, costing more and more lives. NATO and the U.S. would be forced to respond as a result. We're trying to create a war. We must consider these questions thoroughly before we involve ourselves in another one of these crazy conflicts that should never happen. Improvising won't cut it. Now is the time for the U.S. to lead and negotiate a peace to the end of this bloody war. I keep hearing people say, well, we're building equipment for our military. Yeah, right. Or our men and women are not losing their lives. We're getting close to it. We're getting very close. Now look, I come from a military state in the state of Alabama. We build everything. We have thousands of troops. I want it to be well-funded and well-equipped if we ever have to fight a war. We need a lethal killing machine to deter other aggression. That's what a military is about. This is not about defunding our military. I want our military laser focused on protecting Americans and not woke DEI initiatives. And it's not about abandoning our allies either. We need to support our allies. It's about this administration's funding a proxy war with no plan, zero, no plan on how to stop it or how to win it. The Biden-Harris administration needs to negotiate a peace agreement now, immediately. or there will be huge, disastrous consequences coming in the very near future. Mr. President, I yield the floor.